Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Vandenberg Coalition's debate and discussion on U.S., Taiwan, and China policy and the future of how the United States should approach great power competition with China. My name is Carrie Filippetti. For those who don't know me, I am the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition, which is a network of foreign policy experts and practitioners who believe in promoting a strong and proud U.S. foreign policy that's responsive to the interests of the American people across the country. Ultimately, we believe it's the interests of the United States, not of China, that should determine the future of our own country. Now, today could not be a more fitting time for us to discuss the future of our relationship with mainland China. As many of you have seen, today President Biden is scheduled to meet virtually with President Xi to discuss how to, quote, responsibly manage competition between the US and China. Now, today is also the release date for a new report from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where Matt leads their China program, and it chillingly details how Chinese Communist Party influence operations have targeted US state and local leaders as a way to circumvent mounting resistance in Washington to the regime's malign influences at home and abroad. I highly encourage everyone to check out this report if you want to better understand how the CCP is trying to manipulate our country's government from outside the Beltway. So I'll be placing the link to that report in the chat below. Now, it's really my honor and privilege to introduce our speakers, both of whom I had the great pleasure of working with when we served in the previous administration. I'm going to start with Matt Pottinger. Matt is going to lead this moderated discussion and debate with Bridge regarding US policy towards China and Taiwan. And it's about Bridge's recently released book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. I think many of you already know Matt Pottinger, but for those who don't, he is the lead at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's China program, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and of course, a member of the Vandenberg Coalition's board of directors. Prior to these roles, Matt served at the White House, first as senior director for Asia at the National Security Council, and later as deputy national security advisor. Now, both Matt and Bridge are considered two of the leading experts on China. I know that they don't always agree on everything, and so we're hoping that today's discussion illuminates some areas of agreement and contention as we seek to advance the most strategic approach to China's rise. So thank you to both of our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Carrie, thanks a lot. It's great to see you and to be with everyone and to have a conversation with my friend Bridge Colby, who I've known for more than a decade and had the pleasure of working with in the last administration when I was at the White House working on the National Security Council staff. And Bridge came in as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and was really the lead pen and architect for the 2018 National Defense Strategy. This was a seminal document. It was a departure, a discontinuity in many respects for reasons that you'll hear a little bit about as Bridge and I talk about that strategy and about his book. Bridge is now at a co-founder and principal at the Marathon Initiative, and the Marathon Initiative is really a policy initiative that's focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. The post-Cold War era has really shifted into this new era of great power competition. And Bridge, what I thought we would do is really start with something that's both topical but also central to your book, which is really the question of Taiwan. Right, we've got a different set of intentions and descriptions of intentions coming out of Beijing these days when it comes to the future of Taiwan. Deng Xiaoping used to say, if it takes 1,000 years to unify with Taiwan, we'll wait 1,000 years. But with Xi Jinping, you really hear a much more impatient sort of set of rhetoric. He talks about how he's not going to allow this to get kicked from one generation to another anymore. He's talked about how the unification of Taiwan with mainland China is a prerequisite for achieving his overarching vision of a Chinese dream for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So in other words, he's setting a bar for himself, in essence, that if he wants to achieve his overarching objective, it has to include Taiwan. And you see much more menacing rhetoric in the sense that it used to be China would really signal that it was willing to use force to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence. Now the rhetoric's different. I mean, the propaganda is different. It really sort of signals that Taiwan has to actively move toward unification with China in order to forestall military action. And this is going to be a big topic when President Biden holds his first summit with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping today. That's going to be a virtual summit from Beijing to the White House. And we know that Taiwan is going to be a major issue, not least because the Chinese government put out a statement through its state media yesterday, saying that Xi Jinping would impress upon Biden that Beijing is resolved to, quote, realize national unification in the foreseeable future, no matter the cost. So what I wanted to ask you is, what's Beijing's best strategy for actually annexing Taiwan, for unifying Taiwan? You've made clear in your book that it's important that we have a pretty clear assessment in our own minds of what we think Beijing's best strategy is. But why don't you lay it out?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Matt. Thanks to Carrie and the Vandenberg Coalition for this opportunity to talk about these broad issues as well as my book. So it's a real pleasure, and I know there are a lot of people on who are friends and some critics. So I look forward to hearing a good debate. And if we can't finish it here, look forward to continuing it onward. If nothing else, I hope that my book would provoke, but also ideally focus debate and discussion. And so that's this kind of engagement is really especially welcome and valuable for me. It's particularly an honor to be on, speaking of architecting, with the architect of the fundamental shift in American policy towards China, which I think in 100 years will be the most significant event in our time, and that's you, Matt. And not just a shift as in some kind of pivot or rebalance, as if it's some sort of like turning around 90 degrees, but really a fundamental reorientation and rethink and a necessary confrontation with the world's other superpower. And so you represent that more than anybody, and so it's an honor to be with you and also an old friend. So to your question, and actually I was in a little bit of a spat on Twitter, not a spat, but sort of a debate on Twitter about regional expertise versus deductive approach. And there are limitations to both, and I'm kind of more in the deductive category. You bring them both, which is unique, or not, if not unique, very rare, and especially welcome. But I think here we're in a danger, and it seems to me, I think suggested by your question, a sort of a sense that people are kind of caught up in a kind of an incremental or evolutionary expectation of what's going to happen. And I actually think this is misleading and quite dangerous for the reasons. I mean, you mentioned Xi Jinping. I mean, he put out the Chinese Xinhua, I think, put out that quote that they had about him, the sort of Mao-style quote that he's a man of unique determination and focus. And, you could sort of see Mao Zedong on the mountaintop kind of, socialist realism thing. And I mean, that's their public messaging. So, I mean, to your point about what they just said about Taiwan, let it not be said we haven't been warned. I mean, I don't know how much more, and I think this is your point, Matt. They have been very clear about this. So, okay, they want it. I think it's for irredentist reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons, for the points I put out in my book, that it's important to get to their goal of regional hegemony and from their global preeminence. And we can argue about what exactly their goals are. Peter Berkowitz had a thoughtful review in Real Clear Politics, the book, where he emphasized the global aspect a bit more than I do. It's not that they're mutually incompatible. I would say it's more that where do we put our focus? So they have the will. It's kind of overdetermined. They now have the way. And so the question is, how are they going to go about it? To your point, and how do we react to that? Well, a lot of people have this idea that they don't want to risk a war, which is, I mean, I plead ignorance. I don't know what Xi Jinping is thinking. I don't know what they're saying in the Standing Committee, to the extent the Standing Committee is the central, or the Central Military Commission are still meaningful bodies rather than Xi himself. But I don't know how they know that the Chinese won't do something. So I'm not prepared to rule anything out. And as I like to point out, People would not have expected the United States to launch an invasion of Iraq, a few years before 2003, but it happened. Or the financial crisis. People thought financial crises were out before 2008, but they're not. So let's open our mindset. Secondly, I assume the Chinese are serious about this and that they want to resolve it. And what's very clear is people say, oh, they're going to use peaceful means in gray zone and so forth. But they've been doing that for 15 or 20 years. And not only is it not working, it's manifestly failing. It's actually counterproductive for them. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen decisively won re-election. The rates of support for an autonomous Taiwanese identity are going up. Nobody wants to live under the PRC. Obviously, one country, two systems is discredited. So, I mean, there really isn't a peaceful option. I mean, unless you're delusional in Beijing, which I don't think they are. And then the question is, okay, if you're willing to use coercion? Well, I think they're seeing with the Australians that, and we've seen over the last year, look at our blockade of Cuba. Hasn't really done anything. I mean, I wish we had a different government in Cuba, but economic coercion is really hard to make work, especially when you're asking something fundamental of your targeted country, like their autonomy or their effective independence. Okay, so we're talking about military force. Okay, so people say, oh, first they'll take an offshore island and then they'll do cyber attacks and blah, blah. But that just gives us warning and makes them look dangerous and gives us plenty of time to get our heads around the problem. So it's kind of dumb. And I don't think they're going to do something dumb. Instead, you surprise us, you invade the island, you wrap it up, and you present us with a fait accompli, a situation that's really just too prohibitively costly and risky to reverse. That's in my view, I mean, I think that's objectively their best strategy. We can argue about what they will actually do. We can argue about what exactly they want. But I mean, if you're looking at the sort of totality of factors, some variant of that is, I think, if I were in Beijing, that's what I would be arguing for. And I think that's therefore what we need to prepare for.
What do you think so you're very clear just now and in the book, I think, on this notion that, why salami slice it? Why be incremental about it when, as you said, that just coalesces the rest of the world in response to start drawing red lines, right? Beijing doesn't want countries to be drawing red lines if they can move in advance of that. Would Beijing be able to take Taiwan? And by the way, the defense minister of Taiwan recently, in public testimony, it might have been an unprecedented statement. He said Beijing already has the capability to invade Taiwan, but by 2025, middle of this decade, they'll have the ability to do it at much lower cost than what it would be for them to do it right now. Do you agree with that assessment? And second, would Beijing need to attack the United States preemptively, to damage ships, air bases, and other facilities in the region preemptively as a way of guaranteeing their success on the way to invading and occupying Taiwan?
So I think we don't, I don't know. I'm not privy to it. And I mean, fundamentally, nobody knows, right? Because it's a stochastic or inherently unpredictable event, a war. Obviously, there are multiple, sort of intertwined actions, but innumerable. So we don't know, but it's certainly not good. And I mean, if the Taiwan defense minister is saying that, and if credible people like Clint Hinote in the Air Force are saying we're getting our tails handed to us, and people like Dave Ochmanek at the RAND Corporation, well, that's not good. I mean, we're not exactly sure how it's going, but in my view, we're definitely within the window and it's getting worse. So, you and I worked closely together to try to bring focus to this. I think, with things like your Indo-Pacific strategy, with the national defense strategy, we're trying. I'm sort of glass half full, but we're not where we need to be. We're dealing with a superpower rival that's allocating its primary military effort to this on its doorstep. And we're distracted all over the place and haven't been making the change that we need. And now this administration doesn't even seem to be able to publicly say this is an urgent military problem. And maybe this is some esoteric kind of messaging, where we're supposed to understand that, no, they actually are worried about it. But I mean, maybe I'm simplistic, linear, but like, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, they seem to be saying compete and cooperate. So I assume that's going to make it hard for them to focus. And their defense budget submission was not what we needed for the near term, So I'm very worried. And I think it's very plausible that we could lose in the near term, contrary to what General Milley said. I mean, look what he said about the Afghan National Security Forces. So I think we should take that with a grain of salt. I think what Admiral Davidson said is, more credible. So, and defense planning, we should certainly prepare for, if not the worst, then bad outcomes. That's the prudent thing to do. I think what we have going for us is that for China, as you know better than I, the consequences of failure are tremendous. And that's obviously, internal Khrushchev style post-Cuban Missile Crisis, but also regionally, it will sort of embolden and strengthen this coalition effect because people will see that China can be resisted. The one thing I'd want to add that I think is often missed from the discussion on Chinese action on Taiwan is there's an assumption that China doesn't want to directly confront the United States. And I actually think this is wrong. So if China's in earnest about eventually attaining regional supremacy, it will have to put a knife through the heart of any opposing coalition, which is American power and the credibility of American power. And so obviously China would prefer to do that, win without fighting, by demonstrating what the outcome would be, which if we continue on our current course will happen. But at some point, China is likely to have to confront us directly. And I think China's best course of action is to do so on the terms most favorable to itself. And that right now would be a Taiwan scenario would not be determinative. The whole story wouldn't be over, but we would be in a far worse position. So I think your question about whether they will preemptively attack the United States, I don't know. They seem to be suggesting, this is part of the reason I think the strategic ambiguity debate is kind of not what we need to be talking about. I think the Chinese are already assuming that we're going to come in. That's why they're putting mock-up aircraft carriers in the Western desert and shooting missiles at us. If they didn't want to signal to us, they wouldn't be so obvious, right? I mean, that was picked up by commercial satellite imagery. So I think there's a chance I think there's a very decent probability that not only would they go, but they would go in a way that would really knock us back regionally. It would still be limited so that the American people would not, it's probably not a full Pearl Harbor kind of scenario, but where they would put us in a situation where our choices for reversing it are just, too unpalatable.
I saw an article recently, by the way. I think Hal Brands and Michael Beckley wrote a piece that was just exploring China's use of strategic surprise in previous, combat engagements that it's had since the founding of the People's Republic of China against, Vietnam in 1979, against the Soviet Union in their border skirmishes, and certainly against the United States on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. So, strategic surprise counts for a lot when you're able to pull it off. So it's not beyond our imagination that Beijing would seek to guarantee success by, as you said, brushing us back with force, from the region. So tell me a little bit. I mean, you've laid out really what's at stake for China, why it's such a tempting target in a sense. Taiwan would offer Beijing, if Beijing were able to capture it, the ability to establish hegemony in the region, or to make a major stride toward hegemony, if not to really seal that up. And you've talked about what's at stake for the United States, which is, we're on the opposite side of that. I mean, we'd be living in a pretty different world, I think, if Taiwan were to be subjugated militarily. Probably proliferation of nuclear weapons. I would imagine. You've got to imagine that countries in the region would go into a state of emergency and would be looking for alternatives to the U.S. Extended nuclear deterrent. We'd be in a very different world. So the stakes are pretty high for both sides, and I think there is a danger that both sides are underestimating how determined the other is to, in Beijing's case, overturn the status quo, and in ours to maintain the status quo. So tell me, what in a nutshell is the strategy that you put forth in your book, The Strategy of Denial? It's the title of the book. Explain it and maybe talk about some of the alternatives that you thought weren't preferable to what you've laid out in the book.
Sure, and you mentioned that Brands and Beckley article, and I just flagged Dan Blumenthal's important book kind of earlier that made the important case about whether China's a weak sort of or long-term challenges will cause it to move out.
The China nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't have a strong view on that. I tend to be a bit skeptical, even of my good friend Dan's arguments, but I think it's an important case that Dan made. I just wanted to flag it. But what's our strategy? One thing I would say is, I mean, I think we might be lucky if there's friendly proliferation in the region. I think we'd be more likely to see what the academics call bandwagoning. I mean, as Lee Kuan Yew cruelly said about Thailand, they bend before the wind blows. And I think a lot of countries in the region would rush to cut a deal. And I mean, not irrationally. I mean, the Philippines we've been dealing with without a decisive defeat of American military power. How would Manila deal? And without a military presence in the Philippines, very hard to sustain any military operations in the South China Sea. So I think one of the things I sort of concluded after working through this book, I've been focused on Taiwan for some time, but it actually drove home to me how kind of narrower our buffer is than a lot of people appreciate. You know, that we don't have a lot of give at this point, you know, because our coalition is kind of rickety in terms of its confidence. It's aborning, maybe two different adjectives, but you know, you get the point. And if we lose Taiwan, we're going to have to find ways to compensate that are actually going to be more dramatic. I mean, are we going to like become allies with Vietnam, for instance? I mean, that's the kind of thing we're going to have to do in order to compensate, because people are going to see, well, the Americans are obviously not that serious. So why shouldn't I cut my deal with China now? So what's the way to defeat China's strategy? And I mean, I think what I tried to do is kind of come up with the minimum necessary standard for what we need, because for too long over the last generation, we've been pursuing geopolitical and military goals that are well beyond what we needed. And this is kind of a primary reason we've arrived at this sorry place we're in now, is because of that. So we need to really focus. If we can do more, great. But this is what we absolutely need to do. And let me first rule out the other strategies. One is vertical escalation, which I think most people would say is pretty crazy. I mean, there's this argument about sole purpose right now. I obviously, probably pretty obvious, everybody, I disagree with sole purpose or no first use. It's kind of stupid. I don't know why we're even spending any time on it. But I mean, on the other hand, I don't think it's at all credible that the United States would resort to first large-scale use of nuclear weapons. I mean, we might, you know, be willing to use very small-scale first use, but I don't think it's credible that we're going to go large-scale. And if the Chinese are serious, that's what's going to be required to turn them about. So we really need to focus on the conventional level. I mean, the reality is we're not going to trade Taipei for Los Angeles, except under the kind of circumstances I think I tried to explicate in my book, where Taiwan becomes about the much bigger story. So happy to unpack that a little bit more. But so let's rule out first vertical escalation. The more commonly heard one, I think it's a very lazy argument, is horizontal escalation, which is basically to say we're going to respond to China's acquisition, subordination of the island of Taiwan by primarily relying on attacks on Chinese equities elsewhere in the world, sort of geographically, horizontally. I think this fails on a number of levels. The first and most obvious is that the Chinese there's nothing else they value more than Taiwan. So they lose the base in Djibouti or whatever. Okay, fine, done. A second point is that if the Chinese observe that this is the strategy that we are pursuing, they will no longer spend any time on dealing with the near fight, the first island chain fight, right? Because they will see that and they will move to power projection. And in fact, this is what they're already doing. People are lagging in their understanding that the Chinese, yes, are an anti-access area denial military. That is a kind of a defensive shield, but they are now very much a power projection military, and they're becoming more so. So they will be contesting us for sea control out beyond the first island chain. They will be operating in the South China Sea from bases that are far larger than anything we have in the region, not to mention the small countries that operate there, relatively speaking. So they don't really work. And, you know, I was kind of ticked off when Kirk Campbell kind of said to the FT, I think, that like, oh, if Taiwan, the Chinese are going to blow up their economic future. And I just think that's totally incredible. I mean, I think within the United States itself, there would almost certainly be intense pressure on the administration not to wage anything like the level of economic blockade necessary to even get the Chinese to consider giving up Taiwan. I mean, the Larry Finks and the Steve Schwartzmans of the world would be on the phone with the White House and say, forget about it. You're going to tank the economy? No, I mean, come on. And let alone that the Japanese and the Indians, or of course the Russians and the Europeans are going to go along with it. So, I mean, and the Chinese can replace a lot of goods by working with the Russians and the Iranians. So I just don't think so what do we need? We need a strategy of denial, and that is feasible. That's the frustrating thing about this debate, is it's very feasible. I mean, Dave Ochmanek suggested it might cost well under $100 billion. So it could be done within the existing defense budget. Basically defeat the invasion. You know, think of Hugh Dowding's comment about the Battle of Britain in 1940. My job is not to win the war, my job is to defeat the invasion, then we can get to winning the war later, on whatever that means. that is sinking the fleet and shooting down the air armada and killing, capturing, or ejecting or eliminating those soldiers and Marines that land on the island. And that is a feasible goal. And that is what a strategy. If we achieve that goal, then China's faced with this very difficult problem. They can try again, but I mean, we can erode their ability to do so. They can escalate, but they will face a similar version of the problems that we face. So it's not really clear that that's going to, in fact, I don't think it would work. I think it would backfire. And so that's what we can do. And by the way, if we can do it for Taiwan, we can do it for all the other allies that matter to us. So it seems overdetermined why we should do it.
You mentioned the Philippines is vulnerable in your book. You talk about Vietnam as well as other vulnerable nation states within the first island chain. But what I want to do now is actually turn to audience questions, and I'm going to turn back to Carrie to facilitate some questions from the audience that it looks like are starting to come in.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. So yes, just as a reminder, if you are participating, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to see them and we'll take them as they come in. We already have quite a few, so we'll go through some of the early ones. I want to start, Matt, actually kind of pivoting to you to take the spotlight off Bridge for a second. Bridge just outlined the various strategic approaches to China and the ones that he chose to adopt and the ones that he disagrees with. I wonder, do you agree with the strategy of denial? Do you agree with the way in which Bridge has laid this out, either in today's conversation or in the course of his book?
Yeah, I think it's a realistic strategy. I agree with Bridge's assessment of what Beijing's best strategy in the event that it wants to roll the dice and attempt a war. I agree with Bridge on really, the advantages of a strategic surprise, sprinting towards a fait accompli. Although I have serious doubts about Beijing's ability to roll the dice in that fashion without avoiding a war with the United States. I think that even if Beijing were able to occupy, invade and establish a beachhead and begin to occupy Taiwan, it may very well be at the cost of a longer war with the United States. And we've seen through history, a lot of leaders miscalculate how long a war is going to last, right? How many American wars have we been involved in where, the refrain was, don't worry, we'll be home by Christmas. I mean, it's practically every war we've been in. And then you have to say, well, which Christmas, 20 years from now, 3 in the case of the Korean War. So the fact that Beijing hasn't been to war for a long time, you could argue probably not since 1979. Some say that suggests that it's less likely Beijing would be willing to go to war. I have a different view of that. I think that the longer that a nation has not been in combat, the more it tends to overestimate or be rosy in its predictions about what it can achieve through combat. And so I think it's a very compelling book and argument. I'll pause there.
Bridge, I just want to see if you wanted to comment on that before we turn to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think Matt lays it out. This is inherently probabilistic. We don't know. But the one thing I would say, just to a little bit of maybe a different take, is I think China is currently, at least under the sort of notional metrics of preparation for, a protracted war, I think China's better off. I mean, it has a very large shipbuilding industry. It has enormous heavy industrial capacity, whereas we're really not, in a way that wasn't the case in the Second World War. So, my view here is, I think for just so many reasons, the most fundamental of which is that I think it's better to deter a war than wage one, is it's better to front load our efforts as much as possible to see if we can dissuade Xi Jinping from making that cosmic roll of the dice.
So speaking of trying to dissuade him, we have this virtual summit coming up. President Biden would become the first world leader to meet virtually with President Xi Jinping, and this is shortly after she has consolidated his power. So one of the questions that we have received is, what are the implications of this meeting? And then also, what are the various things that you would want President Biden to deliver to President Xi with respect to Taiwan? And this is for either one of you.
Yeah, so, right, COVID times means that leaders are meeting less frequently in person. That's particularly true of China's leader, who has not left China for close to 2 years now, which is interesting, right? We know that COVID's part of that story, but it can't be the whole story, because other leaders, including President Biden, have just traveled abroad. I think it speaks to the degree to which Beijing is looking inward at the moment. Xi Jinping has just done his 6th plenum, where he's elevated himself to really dictator status, on par with Mao Zedong. He's going to be hosting, unfortunately, the Winter Olympics at the beginning of next year. And then a year from now is the all-important once every 5 years part of Congress, where Xi Jinping will formally install himself in power, probably for life, right? In a Leninist system like that, especially one where a leader has rewritten the rules for himself and for himself alone to be able to serve for life, he's probably going to be a fixture there, for quite a long time. Look, I think that President Biden, I've noticed that there's a greater realism within both parties now about what can be achieved through diplomacy with Beijing. In 2017, the first year of the Trump administration, we really bent over backwards to accommodate the idea of talking our way to a more comfortable modus vivendi with China, and China, showed that it wasn't interested. It didn't really deliver when we gave them the opportunity to, for example, stop taking advantage of the United States through the theft of our intellectual property, through cyber hacking and human operations, and through forced technology transfers. Beijing just wasn't that interested in taking us up on that. So we took on a much harder nosed policy beginning at the beginning of 2018. I think that President Biden's team, even though many of them had served in the Obama administration, which was still following sort of an engagement strategy, I think they have a very different attitude about it now. I think they're much more clear-eyed about what we're going to be able to achieve. And this is more about ensuring that there is a channel of communication at the top level. It's really the only level that matters, is when you're dealing with a Leninist dictatorship. You want to have a channel to the guy who's the Leninist dictator in that system. So I think it's good that the presidents are talking. And I think it's also good that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration before them, has pretty much dismissed the idea that mid-level talks through these formal dialogue structures, and we had one in the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and basically we gained nothing from those interminable, very bureaucratic and heavy dialogues among mid to senior level officials. So from what I'm detecting, the Biden administration knows that that's not going to achieve anything. So I'm glad that there's this realism that's taken over in both parties.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions about this idea of reunification and what both of your timelines would be for China's effort to attempt reunification, as well as a number of questions asking about how does the U.S. get Taiwan to do more with respect to its own defense. There are people suggesting that there seems to be a lack of a threat perception from Taiwan that's preventing them from implementing the necessary policies to defend an invasion. How is that, and how might we be able to rectify that?
Great. Maybe I'll jump in first here, Matt, if that's all right. In terms of the timeline, look, again, I don't know, but I'm very worried about the next 5 or 6 years. So, I mean, I compare the China challenge to heart disease, which is, yes, it's a long-term problem, but it's also a short-term problem. And hat tip to Dave Norquist, who helped me improve on this metaphor. But long-term, you change your diet and work out more. Medium term, you take a statin, but near term, you might have to actually get a stent put in. And that's kind of what we need, right? Otherwise, you'll die, right? And so the problem is, well, we know they have a will, and now they increasingly are at least close to having a way. But do they have a sense of urgency, right? I mean, Matt referred to the Deng Xiaoping comment, which always was, we're putting this over the horizon. But I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, the most significant of which to me is, if you look historically at why major wars tend to happen, Dale Copeland's book is very good on this. I think there's a general sense that there's a window of opportunity. Certainly Hitler felt this way. I think the Japanese felt this way. I think also in 1914, that there's an opportunity and that it could close. The biggest reason, and I hat tip my good friend Tom Shugart's work here, is a lot of the investments that started a little bit under the third offset, under the Peerless Bob work that we really tried to accelerate in the Pentagon and the National Defense Strategy, along with Matt's leadership. These will start to materialize in the late 2020s, but then really into the 2030s. Take AUKUS, for example. I mean, those submarines are not coming into the water before the 2030s, right? So if you're China, but they have stuff now because they've been working on it for 25 years, right? And that's their primary scenario. So in the 2020s, as Davidson and others have put it, by 2027, the China Military Power Report also mentioned that date, they could have a very real option that would involve reasonable levels of cost and risk, especially if you're Xi Jinping, you lived in a cave for 5 years, reasonable levels of cost and risk might be different than for us, right? Okay, so that's the biggest thing. There's also other arguments, which, I don't know. I mean, Dan, I think, really introduced the idea that China may have long-term macroeconomic problems. Brands and Beckley have also talked about it. That could be true. I don't know, but that would be an added reason. There's also Xi Jinping's own health, potentially. Maybe he's the one who wants to be the historic figure who exceeds Mao in terms of the Chinese people standing up after the century of humiliation, achieving national reunification. There are any number of reasons, but I mean, the main point is, I think there's enough smoke there to say there's maybe a fire, real fire, and that we're better off trying to put it out. In terms of Taiwan, this is a critical problem, and one we just fundamentally need to treat our allies differently. These are more like business partnerships, deep and profound business partnerships that involve human ties, but if they got to make sense for both of us. And we're not doing, I mean, my argument is this is in America's interest, not Taiwan's interest. The altruistic aspects are add-ons. They're not relevant to the American people. And as I repeatedly say to the Taiwans, our interest in doing it is here. If our costs and risks exceed that, we will have to cut you off, because we cannot destroy our position in Asia to save your skins because you've been lethargic. And so I think we need to, yes, to some extent reassure them, but we need to put more pressure on them. And it should be fierce if necessary. I mean, I think every tool in our toolbox should be available, including economic pressure or whatever it is, direct intervention. I mean, it's not polite to say it in public, but that's the degree of urgency we have. And I think, the other thing that I've thought about, and this is, probably impolitic, but, how did we get the West Germans to spend money in the Cold War? Well, the West Germans knew they had two options. One was, forward defense at the inter-German border, and ideally deterrence, in which case the United States and the other NATO allies would fight at the border. The other was a defense in depth that would be fought on West German territory. And I think that Taiwan should understand that we're not just going to give up, roll over and give up Taiwan. We're going to fight for it. But how we fight for it is going to be dependent. And so maybe they know something that I don't, but they're at the point where I actually said this to some Taiwan counterparts the other day. I said, are you thinking about your escape plan? Because you're acting like you're going to make an inevitability. And by the way, I don't buy this idea that like the Taiwans are going to mount this insurgency. Yeah, maybe a little bit. But I mean, this is the People's Republic of China. Like, they're going to kill everybody and send them to concentration camps and they already, I'm sure, have everybody on the island mapped out. So this notion that they're going to go into the woods and hold out, I mean, maybe a few of them will, but it's not going to make a material difference. I don't think we can rest on that point. So we have to convey to them and to the Japanese an urgency that is uncomfortable to all of us, because otherwise we will fail.
Yeah, I agree with Bridge about the uncomfortable urgency heaven helps those who help themselves. And I think that the American people are going to be looking for, it's going to be an important signal to the American people, to the U.S. government, to the Japanese people, Japanese government, and other U.S. allies. The signal of whether or not Taiwan really has the will to fight. It's an extremely important signal. And I think things are improving now, but we had, worse than missed opportunities earlier this century. We saw sort of a systematic, disassembly in some respects of Taiwan's military capability, in the colossal strategic mistake that the previous Taiwan administration made to dial back compulsory service to a mere 4 months. I'd love to think that you can make great warriors in 4 months. you can get started, but that's does not a seasoned army make. Taiwan has a lot more to do. The sense of urgency should be great. It should be probably greater than it is, and really, the opportunity needs to be taken to communicate directly with the people of Taiwan about what is now expected of them, and what sacrifice is going to entail if Taiwan wants to defend its de facto sovereignty.
So that leads to another great question, which Matt, you mentioned, the important signals also not just for the Taiwanese people, but also to the American people. I think we all kind of here in Washington take it for granted that the seizure of Taiwan would be disastrous for American foreign policy for a variety of reasons. What do you think the average American thinks about this? And do you think there would be popular support for a denial action by the United States that would involve US troops and treasure? And how would you articulate the importance of Taiwan to, everyday Americans, not people who are serving in the Beltway?
Yeah. Well, first, I think there's a growing awareness in the United States. I think, Bridge, you may have flagged a recent poll that, if I remember right, it was a University of Chicago poll that was showing that a majority of Americans thought that, defending Taiwan's democracy was in the American interest. Look, we would be in a very different world where, an authoritarian, really neo-totalitarian system would be calling the shots on the most, populous, largest economic center of the world, which is Asia. Bridge writes in his book of really ranking regions and puts Asia as really the most important region in the world, just by several different measures, including GDP. They get to write the rules how they want them. And the United States would find ourselves in a position where we have less access to the most dynamic economic area of the world. Semiconductor manufacturing, most of the world's advanced semiconductors are made on Taiwan. Those facilities might not survive a war. They might not survive a post-war if the United States were to really put export controls in place that would mean that Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing is not able to continue manufacturing. That would have massive consequences for the global economy. For China, certainly for us, it must be a third of our economy that almost directly touches semiconductors. So, we would find ourselves far less prosperous and far less secure in the event that Taiwan were forcibly annexed.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think Matt described it very well. I would say the bottom line is that I think Americans are actually kind of onto it. There's the Chicago Council poll that Matt mentioned. There's also the Reagan Institute has a poll that's coming out shortly that also shows growing appreciation, I think, for the defense of Taiwan. And I think actually what you tend to see, and it's actually intuitive, which is that the growing appreciation that China is a threat, and where I think, if I can say, that the Reagan Institute poll has shown is significant move among Democrats who've seen how Xi Jinping has treated the Biden administration as well. So now it's truly much more bipartisan, that the Taiwan issue tends to be seen in the context of that, which actually makes sense because it is in the context of that. The problem is, and this gets back to the best strategy point, is that China's incentivized not to present us with a cut and dried case, right? Like Hitler screwed up by invading the Soviet Union or declaring war on the United States, right? China, I think we should be prepared that they're going to do something smarter, which is not go after our sort of strong point, a redoubt. They're going to go after the raggedy edge of our coalition to try to collapse it without having a total war. And Taiwan is their best target. So what's so critical and why I have my hair on fire about this is that the job of our defense establishment is to drive down the costs and the risks to the American people of doing something that makes sense but isn't existential. That's the problem. It's not existential, right? But there could be existential costs and risks entailed, or quasi-existential. It's the job of the military establishment to give the American people options that are reasonably correlated. And I think that's so important. But I think if we can do that, the American people, I think, will back it up. And I think the other thing is, especially if the Chinese move first or have to move first, which they're very likely to do. I don't think, I mean, people ask me, would the Americans defend Taiwan? I mean, it's actually hard for me to imagine the United States not doing it. I mean, especially imagine, frankly, the current administration not doing it. Imagine the political consequences, both at home and abroad. I mean, it's hard. What I worry more about is a feckless defense, which is almost as bad. Or actually is as bad, probably.
We spoke a little bit about, or Bridge, you spoke a little bit about the importance of the credibility of American power, and you also criticized the current administration for its policies on Afghanistan. And of course, we all know that the Chinese Communist Party took advantage of this and said, look, Taiwan, look what your allies do. They'll do the same with you. So Bridge, when you talk about needing to focus predominantly on Taiwan and the China threat, how do we handle other theaters? And a good example here is Ukraine, where the UK is preparing to deploy special forces to the region to protect them. It's something that a lot of our allies and friends on the Hill and in the executive branch are very worried about. So how would you suggest we handle a situation like what's going on in Ukraine should that escalate? You're still muted.
To be brief, the Europeans need to do it. I think we blew our chance to have a graceful multi-theater transition to a focus on Asia. Now we just have to sort of almost drop things. I think people are deluding themselves if they think we're going to be able to manage multiple theaters. I mean, my great friend and colleague, Jim Mitri, pointed out in his article a few years ago, the National Defense Strategy, it's a one-war military strategy. That was under a Republican administration with rising defense spending, AKA not the current administration. So that was basically saying, we need to focus the joint force on being able to win one war, primarily against China, because that's all we can hope to do realistically with a couple other simultaneous missions. So my view is, I mean, first of all, Ukraine's not an ally, so I don't think we should really be getting directly involved, particularly anyway. But secondly, even in the event of an attack on a NATO ally, and I've said this to the Europeans repeatedly, my view is going forward, we're going to have to withhold capacity because of the potential for an opportunistic Chinese move, since Asia is more important. And the solution is for the Europeans to do what is in their moral and strategic responsibility to do, which is actually provide the bulk of their conventional defense, which is what General Marshall and General Eisenhower anticipated, and is wholly within their power to do. And it's primarily a problem for the Germans. So I think what for the United States, we need to like baseline that that's the reality. So I think actually these secondary theaters, particularly Europe, but also the Middle East, they are going to involve a lot of creative and strategic diplomacy. But we have to understand that our hard power needs to be husbanded for the primary theater, because if we like get in a conflict with the Russians, why wouldn't the Chinese go? It would, all the reasons that I've laid out, it would just be intensified, and the timing, the window opportunity would be even more the case. I mean, we only have some, say, B-2s. Let's say half of our B-2s got shot down in the Russia conflict. I mean, that would be half our heavy bomber capacity, penetrating heavy bomber capacity. Patriot missiles, these kinds of, we don't have that many of them. And that's the thing that we really need to baseline when we're talking about. I think still in the blob, there's this sense that we can do everything. And I think that's a very dangerous delusion. And it's not being responsible, in my view, to the American people. And I think the Vandenberg Coalition is rightly saying, what is in the interest of the American people? Well, the first thing is to grapple with reality and then come up with strategies that are key to that, not wishing this away as if we could just will it out of existence.
So Bridge, the critiques of the book, you've just addressed one that people will debate and argue with you about how do you prioritize and the extent to which you need to prioritize. So you make a very clear case that in your view, it's essential part of the strategy to almost ruthlessly prioritize regions and areas. Another critique that's come up is the book is very heavily focused on the military balance of power and the military tools that are at our disposal. What about non-military means of deterring China when we've got major advantages still. People forget what the privilege of us having the US dollar as the world's reserve currency means in terms of our ability to freeze out economy from China from the world economy if we chose to do that, sanctioning banks, or even cutting off the massive flow of U.S. investment into China's stock market, into its A shares, and into its bond market. Things like that some would argue really all of that. The massive amount of U.S. investment in China is a sort of scaffolding that's holding up and giving China the ability to pursue pursue the Chinese dream, including a potential war to unify Taiwan. So what about those non-military means of deterring China?
I actually think those 2 points, thanks, Matt, and I'm glad to be able to address them directly. I mean, I think those 2 things are actually linked, because if you think that hard power and military power may become directly engaged, you see that we lack enough of that to do the 3-theater thing, right, or multi-theater thing. And then you say we have to prioritize, and then we can have an argument. But my argument is, well, if that's what matters, then you focus on the theater where that matters, which is both. Asia's overdetermined. It's the largest economic area, and China is by far the most important other state in the international system. So I'd be interested to hear another. I mean, I know people, for instance, in the administration say Russia's a near-term threat, but frankly, even the consequences of a Russian move into NATO would be more manageable than because there are limits to how far Russia could project power before triggering a balancing. Whereas I think actually if Taiwan fell, we would probably get a lot of bandwagoning. So I mean, it's just, to me, I'd love to see another argument. I just haven't really seen one that I can really grapple with. But and the military thing, look, I mean, I guess, I'm a realist, so is Mao Zedong, right? I mean, power ultimately comes out of the barrel of a gun. I mean, the fundamental nature of sovereignty is coercive, is lethal force, the most coercive thing. And so, China seems to think so. They're investing a ton in their military, yes, in other instruments of national power, but they're finding that those other instruments are not availing, right? Like against Australia. I mean, I think Australia is good news for all of us, and that countries can stand up to economic coercion, but it's also going to make military conflict more likely, because the Chinese are going to be presented with a choice between failure and the use of military force, right? And I think they're likely to certainly consider seriously the latter and use it if it's to their advantage. And I just don't buy that and I mean, I go into it at length in the book, non-military instruments are going to be effective counters. I mean, you're a former Marine, like I don't need to tell you this, right? But I mean, sorry, not a former, you are a Marine. I mean, look, if China has a barrel of a gun down the face of the people on Taiwan, and let alone in the future of the Philippines, maybe Vietnam, et cetera, and certainly the capacity to do so, well, the fact that we're going to cut off banana imports from the Philippines or something, I mean, come on, right? Like that's not going to, and the thing is the Chinese are also an economic superpower. So it's not like we're facing the Soviet Union where we could actually credibly say we're going to cut China. I mean, the dollar will no longer be the reserve currency if China succeeds in its military endeavor, both because it will create an enormous market space and because we will be overtaxing what the dollar can actually do, right? Ultimately, the dollar is, yes, it's because we're a superpower. It's also because people kind of trust it. But if China is now the dominant player over the world economic area, that's going to go out the window. And I think we will lead to the dissolution of our economic advantages, geoeconomic advantages, if we behave that way. So we can't overweight, and not to mention, like Wall Street's going to all these equities or political actors in our system are going to yelp because we're going to be blowing up our own economy. I mean, there's reasons there's so much money going to China. I'm not happy about it, but it's investors have to make a return, right? So if we're saying, we're going to be spiting our nose or cutting off our nose to spite our face. The other one I just like to, because I think it's relevant to Vandenberg's mission, and I just like to address it directly, which is the ideology one. I mean, obviously in this book, I think I just like to clarify, because I think there have been some people who haven't fully grappled with what I'm saying. What I'm arguing is it's not in America. What my foreign policy and defense policy is designed to do is to serve American self-interest, enlightened self-interest, yes, but their self-interest, which includes, of course, our freedom, but also our security and prosperity. That does not mean that we have a direct interest in the political coloration or behavior of other states, right? I mean, we might have a moral case. So I'm a believing person. I care about the fate of other believers in other countries, but I don't think that's something that rises to the level of a core interest of the United States, for instance, right? Just to kind of put my own priors on the table. But this is not the same thing as saying that ideology doesn't matter. I don't tend to emphasize that because it kind of is self-defeating, because it's sort of like so obviously cynical. But it's actually better for people, and this is one of the reasons I would say that some of my, I think one of the reasons that you and I have less of a debate, even though we don't agree on every particular, is because it's sort of like, yeah, we disagree exactly on how ideology would be. Maybe we disagree, but we don't like. It's not really that. We're me and David Feith. Your close collaborator and my good friend as well. So I think what I would say is that I would put ideology in its place, which is that China is not ultimately a challenge primarily or exclusively even because of its ideology. I think a democratic China might have many of the same incentives, and I would still fear it being so powerful, even if it were democratic. But that doesn't mean I'm against China becoming democratic, and it certainly doesn't mean that I'm against using ideology as part of our campaign to elicit support, to undermine the CCP. I'm just conscious that it sounds cynical from me. And I would also say that it's going to be a forum of competition in any case, right? I mean, ideology is important. What people believe is important. So we have to pay attention to it. My point is we need to put it in its place. It's kind of like hard powers first. We get that right. That's what we need to focus on. And we understand what the China threat is about. And then we think about all the areas in which it's in the competition. But that's sort of one other critique that I've heard and I think Peter actually, who has I think he has a similar view to yours, maybe if I could characterize it. I think he kind of got that in his review.
So what I'd like to do, the Vandenberg Coalition does have a good reputation so far of ending things on time. We have a couple more minutes, but what I'd like to do is turn to Bridge and then Matt, just if there's any last minute things that you'd like to say, if there were any questions that you saw that you want to make sure that you address. So we'll start with you, Bridge.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Carrie and Vandenberg, and of course, and Matt, my good friend. And I mean, just if I've been a little bit blunt or provocative, it was designed to, in a short amount of time, try to address some issues and hopefully be engaging. I think my fundamental view is what I hope from this book is that it's a useful and reasonably clear and hopefully rigorous framework within which debates can be had. And if I've had that, if that's been the impact, then I feel that I've succeeded. I don't claim to be the expert on all the issues that I've made claims on. In fact, to the contrary, I just hope to have presented us in a situation in which, look, I've said this to some other people. I mean, I grew up in the 1990s. I feel like a major war seems like something that just doesn't happen. But I look at it deductively, and I look at Xi Jinping, and I say to myself, wow, this could really happen. And I'd rather be on the safe side of deterring it. And so that's what brings my urgency to the issue and my hope to sort of force clarity, if you will, not to exaggerate what I can do. But anyway, it's been a real pleasure in this discussion, and hope to hear more from all of you. Thanks.
Bridge, thanks for doing this, and really enjoyed the discussion. Great questions. We only got to a handful of them. Thanks, Carrie, for selecting some of the more provocative ones. Look, this decade is a dangerous decade. There's no question about it. The factors that favor war are going to increase. Particularly in the middle of this decade, with Taiwan's next election, our next election. It doesn't mean that war is inevitable by any stretch. But some of the things that we need to think about include, our situation at home. If the United States falls into disarray, or we have violence or turmoil at home, history tells us that's as good as an invitation to competitors to roll the dice and attempt adventures. By the same token, if China ends up facing a serious crisis at home, which it's not right now, there are a lot of signs of trouble. with its economy, slowing economy, the potential for financial contagion stemming from the collapsing property bubble, things of that nature that aren't yet crisis, but which could turn into a crisis. If there is a crisis at home, I think it actually reduces the chance of a conflict. History there also tells us countries are more likely to turn inward when they're facing domestic turmoil than they are to try to, wag the dog, as the saying goes. Real wag the dog scenarios are a lot rarer than I think our popular culture suggests. But thanks for everyone for tuning in. I really enjoyed the conversation, Bridge. So best to you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining, for asking questions. Thank you very much, most to Matt and Bridge, for not only engaging in this conversation, but for your fantastic work on China and in the previous administration. It's really an honor. This is the Vandenberg Coalition's first public event, and we could not have asked for more esteemed people to be joining us. So thank you very much. Apologies to those whose questions we weren't able to get to, and I hope everybody has a wonderful beginning of your week.